Thank you, John. And it's a pleasure to be here. And I have to tell you, it's a bit of a tough act. It's a big, tough act to follow a senator, including Senator Boxer, amongst the probably the most notable right now for us. What I wanted to say before I start very quickly is what Senator Boxer talked about with the timing of the WRDA bill is nothing short of amazing. We all know the dysfunctionality of Washington and how difficult it is to move any legislation. And what she did in grease lightning fashion is move a bill to the Senate floor in just a couple of months. And that in and of itself is an amazing accomplishment, irrespective of how the floor debate goes and whether there are amendments put on the bill that she referenced that might occur. One thing I do want to say before I get into some of the stuff that is going to be somewhat disjointed, because I have to throw half my speech away because of the senator's comments. She touched on a lot of it. But what WRDA is a little bit like the canary in a coal mine. I think that if WRDA makes it through the legislative process, it is going to signal the need to modify, for the long run, the earmark ban. Because WRDA is, by definition, an earmark bill. It's project specific. And so if we see WRDA making it through the Senate, and if we see WRDA making it through the House and getting to the President's desk, it will be because the earmark ban has somewhat been modified. And that will spell, I think, the unlocking or unfreezing of the situation in Washington and the dysfunctionality. Okay, I would also suggest to you that what WRDA is all about is defining a new federalism. It's both good and bad for us, but I think if you want to find one word to define what this new bill does, it's devolution. The responsibilities for this program area are going to be further shoved down to the local level to carry out a lot of the activities, and I'll get into that in a second. Okay, so everybody knows, you've heard the factoids about ports and what they do to the economy. The senator mentioned a number of them. One thing that she didn't mention was for every $1 billion of investment in port-related activity, it creates 15,000 new jobs. That's a huge number. And when you look at the middle chart and you see these circles, I don't know if it shows very well, but it graphically illustrates what the senator said about the importance of Western ports. Most of the money is generated by Western ports in the aggregate. But the problem is, everything being political, you look at the number of ports that are east of the Mississippi, and Congress is an entity that works on votes, cobbling together the votes. And that's the challenge the senator and her colleagues have in putting together a bill. And so even though the political economy, given the dire economic situation that we're climbing out of, that the political economy would sort of suggest that they should move a WRDA bill, they should fund it fully, they should release the funds from the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund as quickly as possible. The political economy doesn't work that way because you got to get the votes. And the politics suggests you have to get those East Coast votes to get a bill through, not just the Senate, but in the House, where you've got 400 plus members that have to come together to vote out a bill. And by the way, we do have the nutcase caucus in the House, and in that, they'll vote against anything that causes the federal government to have more exposure and funding. So those are the challenges that we have. I want to take a few seconds, though, and sort of give you a sense of why we have such a challenge in the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund and getting the dollars out. I call it the Rosetta Stone. What this chart shows is the deficit spending problem we have. And what you want to see, if you can see the lines, not so much the past, but the current situation. You see the big gap in the graph? That is the difference between our spending as a percentage of GDP and our taxes as a percentage of GDP. The challenge we have is that over the 20 plus years, whether it's the Vietnam War or the tech boom, funding programs and the taxes raised, they basically were consistent, rather about 20% of spending of GDP and about 18% taxes of GDP. This gap that we're in right now is so huge that it dominates the debate, and it created the challenge of the deficit reduction, and the senator mentioned sequestration. It caused that to happen too. For the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund dynamic, the reason they can't release the money all at once over a couple of years, currently $7 billion surplus, is because the deficit reduction, this is real inside baseball discussion here, but the deficit reduction mandates require no more than a certain amount of spending each year. If you consider that all of our federal dollars are in the same shoebox, If you take money from that shoebox and put it somewhere else, somebody has to make up that difference. And the problem we faced is that there's no way to raise taxes to make up that difference. The problem we face is if you take that money out of the shoebox and put it into the harbor maintenance trust activities, then you have to take money from another program. And then you get into the issue of senators being upset about their pet programs being cut to accommodate the release of more funds. So that, if you really want to know why we have such a challenge, it's because of this deficit. And I know it probably is automatically known to everybody, but the dynamics are even more complicated when you talk about what these folks have to do in Washington to put a bill together. And then, of course, the other issue is you have pay-go. If you raise spending in one area of WRDA, for example, on an appropriation side or an authorization side, you have to cut spending somewhere else, and that causes challenges. Okay, let me quickly, the time I have, go into the issues. I've basically said the issues for us are WRDA, budget process, tax reform, and regulatory reform. WRDA basically captures all of these issues, okay? And I do want to say one thing. If you thought that the air traffic controller debate was raucous and painful to watch in Washington, get ready, because now we're going to get into the real issues. If we have a second sequestration triggered come October 1st, the pain and suffering is going to be so dramatic that the air traffic controller issue is going to look like a walk in the park. And that's why I'm hopeful that they're going to have some kind of a budget agreement at the end of the day or the end of the summer. Okay, so if we look at WRDA, a couple of thoughts. I mentioned devolution. Regulatory streamlining. The Senator's bill has a whole bunch of provisions to give local agencies the authority to carry out more of the activities that the federal government used to do. I think you're going to see more and more of that in order to get around the budget constraints at the federal level. They're going to be pushed onto you folks to do the work, whether it's a feasibility study, which may be good because you can get things done maybe a little faster than at the federal level, or maybe it's construction activities that you can undertake. Burden of responsibility. It would seem automatic that with that devolution of responsibilities that you would see the burden of responsibility almost de facto, if not by law, shifted to you. But the Senator's bill reaffirms the constitutional prerogatives of the federal government to take responsibility for WRDA-type activities, so that's a good thing. Funding points of order. This is the big stickler the Senator made reference to. Her bill provides for maximum funding through the trust fund. She provides for all core programs to be funded at levels equal to the current year funding that you are, or the past year's funding of program spending. That's a challenge, because if there's a point of order that can stop the bill from going forward, then you have nothing being funded. From an appropriations committee standpoint, they're saying that's our jurisdiction. We'll make decisions on how to spend money under WRDA programs. And so you've got this big fight that's going to either take place, or it sounds like the Senator referenced that they're discussing how to fix things. I think that we'll see a fix, and I think there'll just be a reaffirmation of the priority of WRDA funded programs. And I think what you'll see is at least current level spending maintained through the appropriations process as a negotiated settlement in the coming year. Alternative financing. She mentioned WIFIA. It's a very good program on one level. On another level, what we have to be concerned about is additional red tape. I know the Senator is committed to making certain that that's not going to happen, but the way the bill is written, it gives the EPA and the Corps of Engineers a tremendous latitude to design the regulatory process that implements WIFIA. So I think that in the final analysis, we'll just have to wait and see how that works. And resiliency, I'll skip over that, but just say that the Senator, obviously, as she pointed out, is fully engaged on that issue, has been for several years, and I think that that may be one area where you see growth and funding assistance. Fiscal year 2014 budget priorities, and this is the President's budget priorities, but I think they're consistent with the concept of the theory that we're not going to do great leaps and bounds, but we're going to make sort of small incremental progress in moving funding programs forward. President asked for $4.8 billion in the core budget. That's essentially current year funding. There's $100 million of rescissions, but that doesn't affect California. The Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, $890 million appropriated request-wise. Inland Waterways, $44 million. The key here I wanted to say is at least you're getting close to $1 billion. I mean, there is no way that right now you can see a RAMP Act or anything else triggering more spending because of that inside baseball discussion that I had earlier, where if you take money from one program or raise funding for a program, you got to take it from another program, and there you lose the votes, and the appropriators say, no, we can't do that, it violates the budget agreements. So I think what we're going to see is a minimum of $890 million, and maybe Senator Dianne Feinstein, who sits as the chair of the Appropriations Subcommittee with jurisdiction over this fund, will find ways to put a little bit more in. I'm hopeful. The other thing is I want to say is with the Economic Development Administration, FEMA, Department of Transportation, these are in here because they offer ways to cobble together through different programs assistance. I would say that the other message I want to leave with you is look for as many federal program funding opportunities to address your needs. And then finally, the financing tools in the toolbox, going back to WIFIA, but going a little broader. The administration is seeking a new way of financing infrastructure. They want to create an infrastructure bank. That's great. They're going to provide in the budget request $50 billion for high priority transportation projects, which could include port-related multimodal type activities. The challenge you have is that in an infrastructure bank, you lose the singularity of your priority, and you're not going to end up competing with other infrastructure needs. So we'll have to watch that one carefully, because I could see Congress saying we don't have enough money, so let's just move forward and combine everything together and let sort of like a sort of a fair-all fight, if you will. Everybody goes competing after the same block of money. Hopefully WIFIA gets through. That'll at least be isolated and support water infrastructure projects. The president also wants to do a reestablishment of the Build America Bonds program. That was the program that provided cash subsidies to build infrastructure. We'll see if that happens. The big issue that you should be very concerned about, though, from a public infrastructure standpoint, is the White House is doing something that other White Houses have done, and it's to try and modify, if not curtail, the availability of tax-exempt financing. This is a huge issue. $1.7 trillion in the past 2-3 decades committed to public infrastructure through tax-exempt financing. If the president's effort, and this is not just this president, other presidents have tried it too. If the president's effort is successful in modifying the availability of the tax value of a tax-exempt bond, it will raise the cost of building public infrastructure. The premise is that anybody who makes more than 28% income tax bracket-wise is subject to a higher tax rate should not be taking advantage of these bonds. I would argue to you that if in fact there is somebody sitting on a stoop in Oakland or Baltimore or New York City that invests in tax-exempt securities to shelter their income, and it's at the 28% or below rate, then this is not a big problem. But I think common sense tells you that big institutional investors, the wealthy, use these bonds to shelter their income. They provide a public good, and it's going to be a fight. It really will be a fight. So I would argue to you that there's a new paradigm to address budgetary constraints of the federal government. The first is you're going to see the devolution of responsibilities, and you're going to see integration of planning activities. The Corps has a 3x3x3 process. It's a fancy title, but really what it says is let's get all the levels of the Corps working together. Let's try and get feasibility studies done within 3 years and keep it under $3 million. Penalties for delays, I think that on the regulatory streamlining front, you're going to see increasing pressure for the federal government to deliver their records of decision, deliver their obligations to project development, or face penalties. I think beneficiary pays and enhanced credits for projects from the local sector, that's going to be a big issue. I think that that's in the Word of Bill right now the Senator's put out, and I think you're going to see more of it. Multimodal issues, I think you're going to see increasing demand to do that because the resources to do individual projects and not find economies of scale are only going to get smaller, and so economies of scale are going to be more and more important. And I think as far as NEPA reviews go, there's an effort right now to say if your state has an equal or more stringent NEPA-like process to do program and project reviews, then they should take priority. This has raised a lot of hackles in the environmental community in the Senate, but I think this is the future. I think the inability for the feds to do everything is going to force this devolution. So I think in the case of CEQA, you're going to see increasing efforts to allow the state, which is done in the transportation bill right now, to conduct these NEPA reviews in lieu of the feds. And then finally, alternative financing. There's no way out of the problems that we have without finding solutions, be they Build America bonds, a WIFIA bank, an infrastructure bank, or private activity bonds. And I will say, as a closing thought, the senator mentioned attracting private monies or public-private partnerships. I truly believe that this is the era, whether you politically like it or not, for public infrastructure, public-private partnerships are now something that you have to look at seriously if you're looking at ways to reduce the cost to the public at large. So with that, in the interest of time, I'll end there, and thank you very much.